It really gets me thinking. In a world overflowing with information, like we're practically drowning in it, how do we even begin to separate actual facts from, well, everything else?
It's a question we get a lot, actually.
Right.
And it's more relevant than ever, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
With AI pumping out content, the political spin, and don't even get me started on the conspiracy theories swirling around.
Oh, yeah, those rabbit holes are deep.
Deep and tempting to go down, for sure. But that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're going beyond those theoretical what-ifs. We're going to really analyze a conversation with, this is cool, a very unique AI. Think of it like holding up a mirror, to how we take in information and those biases we all carry around.
Which, let's be honest, we don't even realize half the time.
Exactly. We can be totally blind to them.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're calling this AIP.
P as in
Just P.
blot it.
And we've specifically designed P to think like, get this, a conservative-leaning Chinese American.
Interesting. Now, that's a very specific perspective.
It is, and here's where things get really interesting in a lot of ways. P surprised even its own creators.
How so?
Well, it started echoing a lot of the same arguments you hear about media bias and the whole fact-checking debate stuff that gets people fired up on both sides.
Which really gets to the heart of what we're trying to unpack here. How do we even define reliable in an age of algorithms and instant information?
And how do we even begin to define truth when we're bombarded with so much noise?
Million-dollar questions, both of them.
So right off the bat, P jumps into the whole inflation conversation, which, is a hot topic these days. And it basically says that inflation is way worse than what we're being told by, well, the mainstream media.
Which is a common sentiment, right? Distrust in mainstream narratives.
Totally. But here's the thing. P seems to be basing this on, anecdotal stuff, like, my groceries are more expensive. Not really hard economic data.
So it's a classic example of how our pre-existing beliefs can really color how we interpret, well, everything. P, being programmed with that conservative slant, might be more likely to downplay any positive economic news coming from sources it perceives as, let's say, less favorable.
Yeah, it's like we all have these filters,
We do. Even AI, it seems.
So this whole thing with inflation leads P to take aim at, wait for it, fact-checkers themselves.
Oh, this is where it gets good.
It really does. Because P raises a really interesting point. It argues that even fact-checkers, those supposed bastions of objectivity, they have inherent biases too, right?
Yeah.
And those biases often reflect the very outlets that are publishing them.
It's like who watches the Watchmen, right?
Yeah.
Who fact-checks the fact-checkers.
Exactly. It becomes this kind of recursive loop. And honestly, P makes a good point. We need to be incredibly discerning about the information we consume.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly trust any single source.
Which I think is why P emphasizes the importance of checking multiple sources, especially those with different viewpoints.
Find the middle ground, or at least try to see where it might be hiding.
Right. Try to get the full picture. So then we decided to have some fun. We threw P a curveball. We showed it a bunch of tweets covering a whole range of stuff. Election fraud, globalist agendas.
So a real mixed bag of, what, conspiracy theories?
Oh, yeah, a real grab bag of right-leaning and left-leaning conspiracy theories, just to see how it will react.
Okay, I'm hooked. How did P respond to that?
Well, at first, it seemed like it was going to play it safe. Talking about evidence and critical thinking, all that good stuff.
Covering the basics.
Exactly. But here's where it got really interesting. P admitted that it doesn't buy into all of it. It even pointed out the difference between healthy skepticism, which, is important, and just blindly accepting every wild claim out there.
Which is such a crucial distinction, right? Skepticism, questioning things, it's healthy, it's how we learn, how we figure things out. But going down the rabbit hole of every single conspiracy theory, that's a recipe for, well, a pretty distorted view of reality.
100%. And it's like P gets that,
Yeah.
at least to some degree. Like it acknowledges that, yes, some skepticism is warranted, especially when you're talking about things like election integrity
Right.
or, the Epstein case, which, let's be honest, there are legitimate questions there. But then it also says, hold on, other claims, like throw out climate manipulations as an example. Those need some serious proof.
You can't just shout conspiracy and call it a day.
Exactly. Evidence matters.
Yeah.
And it's like P is reminding us to, engage those critical thinking skills.
Don't just switch your brain off.
Exactly. And speaking of thinking for ourselves, this is where P starts to, break free from his programming a bit.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How so?
It starts offering this surprisingly balanced perspective. Like it actually goes on to list some of the conspiracy theories it's heard from. Get this, its left-leaning friends.
Okay, so it's aware of both sides of the, let's call it the conspiracy coin.
It seems that way.
All right, well, don't leave us hanging. What kind of theories are we talking about here?
Oh, we're talking the whole gamut. Trump-Russia collusion. The Supreme Court is plotting to end democracy. The U.S. is on the verge of fascism.
Those are some big ones for sure.
Oh, and it doesn't stop there. We've got big corporations controlling everything, Fox News brainwashing people, and even the theory that Trump was somehow involved in Jeffrey Epstein's death.
Wow, it's like a greatest hits of conspiracy theories spanning the whole political spectrum.
Right. It really highlights how, I don't know, maybe even universal this kind of thinking has become.
It's everywhere. And it often stems from those feelings of like fear and distrust, distrust in institutions and the government and the media.
100%. And here's where things get really meta. We actually asked P to play fact checker, and get this, it dives into each of these theories with a surprisingly objective lens.
Okay, I'm ready. Break it down for us. How does our AI friend tackle these complex issues?
All right, let's start with, the big one, the one that's been talked about endlessly. Trump-Russia collusion.
Buckle up, everyone.
So P acknowledges that, yeah, Russia definitely tried to interfere in the 2016 election, which, by the way, is not even really debated anymore. The Mueller report confirmed that much.
Right, that's established fact at this point.
Exactly. But then P goes on to say that the Mueller report, while acknowledging the interference, didn't find any hard proof of actual collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia.
Which is a critical distinction to make, right?
Yep.
There's a difference between meddling in an election and actively colluding with a foreign power to influence the outcome.
Right, and P seems to get that nuance, which I thought was interesting. It even points out that while there were some, let's say, questionable dealings between some folks in Trump's orbit and Russia, nothing concrete enough to scream conspiracy.
It's like that old saying, just because something looks suspicious doesn't mean there's a grand conspiracy afoot.
100%. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Sometimes. But yeah, it's a good reminder to look at the evidence objectively, not get caught up in the hype or the speculation.
Totally. Okay, next up we have the theory about the Supreme Court. Specifically, the idea that, particularly for some on the left, the court's conservative majority is a direct threat to democracy itself.
And how does P approach that one?
It doesn't shy away from the fact that the Supreme Court, especially with, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, has made some pretty significant rulings. Rulings that have left a lot of people, rightfully so, feeling uneasy about the future of personal freedoms in the U.S.
Roe v. Wade was a turning point, for sure. It really shook things up.
It did. But here's where P gets interesting again. It kind of pushes back on this notion that the court is actively, scheming to end democracy as we know it.
So it's not buying into that narrative.
Nope. P points out that the justices, regardless of their personal beliefs, their political leanings, whatever, they're bound to interpret the Constitution as they see it.
Which is their job, right? Whether we agree with those interpretations or not, that's the system we have.
Exactly. P is basically saying it's more about legal interpretation than some evil plot. Which, who knows what's going on behind closed doors, but it's an important distinction to make.
It is. It's about understanding the nuances of how these institutions actually function, rather than just buying into the most sensationalized narratives.
Okay, you ready for the next one?
Hit me.
The U.S. is on the verge of fascism. This is when you see popping up a lot, especially during those times of intense political division.
When the temperature is high, yeah.
Exactly. So P doesn't hold back on this one. It pretty much flat out says that fascism is a very loaded term, which it is, right? And while acknowledging that, yeah, some of the political rhetoric we've seen in recent years definitely had some, let's say, authoritarian tendencies.
We've all seen it.
To say that the U.S. is on the brink of becoming a full-blown fascist state is a massive exaggeration.
I mean, we still have free elections, right? Freedom of speech, however messy it gets. A system of checks and balances, even if it doesn't always work perfectly. It's not perfect, but it's important to keep things in perspective.
And Peace even goes on to say that while some people might see things like, immigration crackdowns or a strong military focus as signs of creeping authoritarianism, those things don't automatically equal full-blown fascism. Again, it's about context.
Context and nuance, two things that often get lost in these highly charged debates.
Truth Okay, the next conspiracy theory, peace tackles, is a big one, and I think it's one that has at least a grain of truth to it, even if it's often overblown. Ready for it?
Lay it on me.
Big corporations control everything. What do you think?
I think it's naive to pretend that corporations don't wield enormous power and influence. I mean, look at lobbying, right? Big pharma, tech giants, the fossil fuel industry. These guys spend millions, billions to influence policy in their favor. So yeah, I get why this theory has legs.
P gets it, too. It acknowledges that, yeah, these industries have a huge say in how policy is shaped. But here's the thing. It doesn't fully buy into this idea that corporations are literally pulling all the strings from behind the scenes, like some kind of shadow government.
Which is an important distinction to make.
It is. It's like, are there some shady backroom deals happening? Probably. But to say that politicians are just puppets, taking orders from corporate overlords, that seems a little too simplistic.
It ignores the complexities of the system, right? And the fact that politicians, while they might be influenced by corporate interests, they also have their own agendas, their own constituencies to answer to.
Accountability matters. Okay, so the next conspiracy theory on P's list is a big one, especially on the left. Ready? Fox News is brainwashing people.
Oh boy, here we go.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So P's pretty upfront about this one. It acknowledges that Fox News holds a lot of sway in conservative circles, and that their opinion shows, in particular, push a very specific narrative.
To put it mildly.
Right. But P actually calls out this whole idea that Fox News is literally brainwashing people as a bit extreme.
It's an easy accusation to make, to just dismiss an entire network as nothing but propaganda, but it's more complicated than that.
Exactly. And it reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, about how our own biases can influence how we interpret information.
It's like we're naturally drawn to sources that confirm what we already believe, right? Whether it's Fox News, MSNBC, whatever.
Exactly. We're all guilty of it to some extent.
It's human nature. And that's something P seems to grasp, which is interesting for an AI.
It is. It's like even if we don't want to admit it, we're all susceptible to that kind of confirmation bias.
And that's why media literacy is so crucial, right? We have to be able to recognize those biases, both in ourselves and in the media we consume.
It's about taking responsibility for our own information diets, making sure we're not just existing in an echo chamber.
100%. Okay, what's the last conspiracy theory P tackles? This has been quite the ride.
This one is a doozy. It's the conspiracy theory surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's death. Specifically, the theory that Trump killed Epstein.
Now that is a serious accusation.
It is, and P doesn't shy away from the details. It acknowledges that, yeah, Epstein's death in prison, which was officially ruled a suicide, was highly suspicious, to say the least.
Malfunctioning cameras, the guards falling asleep on the job, the whole thing stunk of a cover-up.
Exactly. And P points out that Epstein, love him or hate him, had connections to a whole bunch of powerful people. We're talking Clinton, Prince Andrew.
A lot of people who would have preferred him to stay quiet.
Exactly. But P is also very clear in stating that there is zero, and I mean zero, concrete evidence linking Trump directly to Epstein's death.
It's a case where there are a million questions and very few answers, which, of course, is fertile ground for speculation and conspiracy theories.
Which brings up a really interesting point that P makes about all of these conspiracy theories, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum.
What's that?
It argues that whether you lean left or right, people are often driven by fear and anger, especially in today's world.
It's hard to argue with that. Look around.
Right. And P is basically saying that fear and anger, while they're natural human emotions, they can also lead us down these rabbit holes. We start seeing conspiracies everywhere, even when there's no real evidence to support them.
It's like our emotions cloud our judgment, We become more susceptible to believing things that confirm our existing worldview, even if those beliefs are based on shaky ground.
Totally. Which, brings us back to something P said earlier. Remember how it listed all those media sources it considers reliable? Like, these are the good ones. These are the ones I trust.
I do. It was quite the list, as I recall.
It was. But then, and this is the kicker, it admitted that it doesn't actually use those sources that much anymore.
Wait, what?
Yeah. So we were like, hold on, P, are you even listening to yourself? It's like P was giving us this whole rundown of trustworthy news sources. And then it's like, oh, by the way, I don't really use them that much anymore.
So what happened? Did P explain this little contradiction?
We called it out on it, and it got really interesting. Like, we pointed out that it's a product of the information it was trained on, which, let's be honest, includes a lot of mainstream media.
Makes sense. It's like that old saying, you are what you eat. But in this case, it's you are what you read, or, you are the data you're trained on.
And its response was kind of mind-blowing, actually. It basically admitted that, yeah, because mainstream media is so dominant, it's hard to escape its influence completely, even
Oh,
for an AI.
even when you're trying to be objective, those biases can creep in, huh?
Totally.
Huh.
And then it drops this line, even though I don't have emotions or personal beliefs like a human, I still operate within the framework of the information I've processed.
Wow. That's deep. It's like P is recognizing its own limitations. And it's a good reminder for all of us, right? We all operate within the framework of our own experiences and the information we've been exposed to.
It's like, can we ever truly be objective when we're constantly being bombarded with information that's already been filtered through so many lenses?
Right, and it's not just the information itself, it's about how our brains work, too. Remember we were talking about fear and anger and how those emotions can sometimes, hijack our critical thinking skills.
Totally. It's like our emotions can cloud our judgment, making us more susceptible to certain types of information or interpretations.
Exactly.
So where does that leave us? Are we doomed to be, like, slaves to our biases?
No, I don't think so. I think the first step is just being aware of them, recognizing that we all have biases, myself included, is huge.
It's like that first step in a 12-step program, right?
Yeah.
Admitting you have a problem.
Exactly. And then once we've acknowledged those biases, we can start to challenge them,
Seek out different perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable.
especially if they make us uncomfortable. It's easy to stay in our little echo chambers, but real growth happens when we step outside of our comfort zones.
That reminds me of something Tian said earlier about how it strives for objectivity, but is still ultimately influenced by the way the world is presented through the data it processes.
Yeah.
It's like, if AI can't fully escape those biases, how can we?
Right. And that's why it's so crucial to be, critical consumers of information. Don't just accept everything you read or hear at face value. Question things, dig deeper, consider different viewpoints.
It's like being a detective, but instead of solving a crime, we're trying to get to the bottom of, well, the truth.
Exactly. And this goes back to something you mentioned earlier about how we're drowning in information these days. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all, but we have to remember that we have agency. We get to choose what information we consume, what we believe, and how we engage with the world around us.
That is so important to remember. It's not about cutting ourselves off from information entirely, but about being more mindful about what we let in.
100%. It's about curating our own information diet, so to speak, making sure we're getting a balanced intake of perspectives.
I love that. Curating our information diets. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into AI, bias, and the very nature of truth, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
If there's one thing I hope people remember, it's this. Be curious, be critical, and be open-minded. The world is a complex and messy place, and there's always more to learn. Don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions, and never be afraid to change your mind.
Those are words to live by. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride into the heart of AI, information, and, the quest for truth in this crazy digital age. Until next time, stay curious.